If you're a fan of Japanese RPGs, you may have heard about the recent Kickstarter launched to revive two beloved series from the PS2 era. The first dual Kickstarter has already met its earliest goals, and it looks as if both projects will be steaming full speed ahead, including Pennyblood, the spiritual continuation of the Shadowhearts series. Shadowhearts was a trilogy of games on the PS2 which blended together elements of horror and the Gothic with traditional RPG mechanics, and were much beloved for their darker tone and the blend of historical and fictional elements, which pulled on real-world history for its world-building. They are a unique part of gaming history, but they're not the beginning of the story. In fact, Shadowhearts was itself a sequel of a sort to a lesser-known PS1 title, which during its release received mixed reviews. Either it was adored as a bone-chilling experience with an incredible story, or maligned as a poor blend of experimental RPG design with survival horror style. That game was Koudelka, perhaps the first of its kind, a survival horror RPG which attempted to create a Resident Evil-esque experience with turn-based combat and character leveling. It was experimental, it was brave, and in many ways it was ahead of its time, trying to implement a fusion of two genres at a time when technology was fast evolving and CG was just starting to come into the gaming scene. It's a fascinating project, and one that made history more than once, pushing the envelope for game development in voice acting, CG design, motion capture, music, and more. The finished product may have elicited mixed reviews at release, but in retrospect, the game is not only a fantastic experience and a must for horror aficionados, it is also certainly one of the best horror games on the console. It was the creation of a team of young developers setting off on their own to create more freely, led by an incredibly talented artist, writer, and musician, better known for his career as a game soundtrack composer. Koudelka would be Kikuta Hiroki's one and only director and writer credit, and it's a project he still remembers fondly. Kikuta Hiroki was born in 1962 in the Aichi Prefecture of Japan, in an area he describes as rural. His father, a war veteran, was a ceramics researcher who wanted his son to follow in his footsteps. By elementary school, it was clear Kikuta had little interest in kilns or clay, but he was very much a fan of reading. From a young age, science fiction, which was very much on the rise in Japan at the time, and nonfiction had become his favorite genres to read, including works from home and imports from the West, such as the works of Alfred Elton van Voigt, particularly The Voyage of the Space Beagle, and Edogawa Ranpo's Boys Detective Club. He read nonfiction about NASA's space exploration, Heinrich Schliemann's archaeological research, and Cousteau's undersea voyages. In junior high, he was fascinated by the works of Tsusui Yasutaka, who is lesser known in the West, though two of his works have been adapted into major animated films, Paprika and The Girl Who Leapt Through Time. He found his way into art through the Gundam series, desiring for the first time to draw something for himself after being inspired by the anime series. The world of Gundam, particularly the Space Runway Ideon work by the same creator, felt like the perfect blend of human drama and science fiction to him, and it truly sparked his interest in creation. A novelization of Gundam showed him that anyone, not just official novelists, could write a story, and first gave him the idea he might write stories of his own. He would attend Kansai University, majoring in religion and philosophy, and while there, he entered a manga club that would inspire his choice of career. It was a large group of like-minded manga fans who came together to draw, and each month would publish a collection of their works. It was freewheeling and had little oversight or control. Anyone could draw what they wanted. It encouraged expression and creativity, and first inspired Kikuta to consider a career as a manga artist. And that's just what he would do once he graduated in 1985. He stayed in touch with some of his friends from the club, particularly Murata Atsutoshi, who not only was in the club, but also in a band with Kikuta and liked his music. Kikuta had been interested in music for some time. He was completely self-taught, reading books and playing instruments on his own, and had been composing since he was 12. Murata became a programmer at a graphics lab working on CG and taught Kikuta some of his techniques, while also encouraging him to try his hand at making music professionally. Murata had instruments, and Kikuta would visit and compose from time to time. He found over time that drawing manga simply wasn't his calling, and he was trying to find out exactly what that calling would be. His friend Murata would come through for him. He bought Kikuta a synthesizer that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and told his friend, "Use this to make music." So he did. And those first demos would lead to the start of his music career, which began in anime, making soundtracks for shows like The Legend of Snow White. He was still using his manga artist name, Yuri69, at the time, but would eventually start using Kikuta Hiroki, which is not his birth name. In fact, it's Yuri, but many would mistake the name for the feminine Yuri, which led to enough frustrating misunderstandings that Kikuta decided to change the name he went by to Hiroki. He was looking to find a stable career that would allow him to continue working creatively on the side. Working on manga was just too hard and financially unstable, and he was looking for a new direction. Music had worked out so far, so why not apply to compose for other projects? He decided to start applying, in particular to video game companies. Kikuta grew up on games, especially arcade titles and fighting series like Virtua Fighter. He was hooked to Namco's titles. He played Xevious and was addicted to a game called Bosconian. During the hot summers, he'd stay in the air-conditioned arcades all day until he was asked to go home. But the companies he'd end up applying to, he had no experience with. The first was Falcom, who turned him down. The second was Squaresoft. He sent them his demo tape, not expecting to hear anything, but was surprised when he was called in for an interview. So he put on a suit and tie and rode the subway over to Asakusa, where Square's offices were centered at the time. Two men would interview him, Ito Kenji and Uematsu Nobuo, both legends in the game's music industry, but at the time, they were still early in their careers. Kikuta entered the office with no expectations. He was sure they were going to gently turn him down. To his surprise, Uematsu addressed him, asking a question about his demo tape. "So you like progressive rock, huh? The song on your demo reel reminds me of Alan Holdsworth." To his shock, they had a connection, an interest in the same music. They had a delightful time discussing how they could reproduce a Holdsworth-esque guitar sound, and before long, Kikuta had the job. Over 100 people had applied for the position, and only one, Kikuta Hiroki, would become a Squaresoft composer in 1991. His early work consisted of debugging Final Fantasy IV. It wouldn't be until his second project that he would be creating sound. Assisting Ito Kenji on Romancing Saga, he would create all the sword battle sound effects. After Romancing Saga, Ito was meant to be composing for the second game in the Mana series, but he was unable to do so. And so the project was handed to Kikuta, and it became his first full video game soundtrack. He refers to that time as his sleeping bag era, as he worked long hours, often late into the night, and would sleep in the office. Squaresoft at the time had a policy of one musician, one project, so Kikuta didn't often work together with other musicians. But overall, it was a relaxed environment. Game development was divided into 3 sections: Final Fantasy, led by Sakaguchi Hironobu, the Saga series, led by Kawazu Akitoshi, and the Secret of Mana series, led by Tanaka Hiromichi. But the music division was kind of its own thing, led unofficially by Uematsu, and the musicians rarely had their superiors or producers interfering with their work. They were allowed to create according to their tastes, and would then hand off their work to others who would pick and choose what fit their project and use it appropriately. In that way, Kikuta had almost total creative freedom. It was his third project that would lead Kikuta to meet a young, talented musician by the name of Hidenori Suzuki. He was only 18 at the time, and was a synthesizer programmer who would assist Kikuta in the implementation of music, cutting down on the amount of work Kikuta had to do on his own. Because of the shared workload, he was able to compose more than 3 times the amount of musical tracks he had for Mana 2. This was a time when Kikuta would be meeting many he would later work with in more depth. And it would be a time of change for everyone at Squaresoft. The typical framework of the company would shift with the changing roles of Sakaguchi and others, and for a whole year, Kikuta would find himself with little work to do. It would be around this time that Square began experimenting with smaller teams of new developers. It was meant to foster younger talent and allow them to learn the ropes while stretching their creative abilities. And one of the projects that was part of this initiative was called Sokagi, an action RPG set in a fantastical version of Japan. Kikuta would be offered the role of composer for the game, and he accepted. It was described as Square's first third-person action title, and expectations were high, but the game would receive mixed reviews at launch. The story and music were highly venerated, but gameplay elements were often disliked, and Kikuta himself had mixed feelings about the experience. There was more he wanted to do. He wanted more control and influence on his gaming projects, and he felt frustrated with the lack of control he'd had on Sokagi. This was what sparked the idea of leaving Squaresoft to establish a studio of his own. Freedom is a quality Kikuta values highly. He describes progressive rock as freeing, and appreciates his time as a Square composer as having been very free creatively. There were also incredibly high expectations while working at Squaresoft. This was a huge company with a very big reputation, so sales goals were always high. A game that sold 300,000 units could be considered a failure, which limited how much the teams could experiment and play around. Kikuta wanted to create without being hounded by huge financial expectations. And lastly, the divisions at Square were, well, divided. Musicians did not work with planners, programmers did not work with artists. Kikuta wanted to have his hands on all elements of the project, and felt that Square's style of dividing and conquering meant that the game teams felt isolated. During his work on music for Square, he would often seek out the game artists on his own to talk about the project. They would go out to drink after work and found that sharing about their work influenced the project itself. His music could influence the art, and the art his music. But Square wasn't naturally designed to encourage that creative flow. So the dream of Saknoth began, and Kikuta wasn't the only one leaving Square to follow that dream. It likely began sometime around August of 1996, according to one team member's records, and it would involve more than half a dozen former Square employees, primarily musicians. One of these was Itakura Matsuzo, better known as Machida Matsuzo, who worked as an artist at Square doing background design on Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VII, and mechanical CG modeling for Xenogears. He would become Koudelka's art director, and play a very major role in Saknoth's future. Another was Hidenori Suzuki, the young synth programmer who assisted Kikuta on Mana 3. He joined Square in 1992 and was in charge of the sound programming for games on consoles, and would work on Super Mario RPG, Final Fantasy Tactics, and Xenogears before the Mana series. Many of Saknoth's establishing members came from the Mana 3 project. Another was Hirota Yoshitaka, who not only worked at Square, but was also performing in a band and DJing at night to keep his love of music and performance alive. At work, he was behind a desk. On stage, he could jam and rock out to the music as he worked. He came to Square through his friendship with Matsuda Yasunori. He'd been having money troubles when Matsuda invited him to apply at the company, and feeling rather aimless at the time, he thought he'd give it a try. He would go on to work on sound effects for Final Fantasy, Parasite Eve, Front Mission, Chrono Trigger, and Mana 3. For Final Fantasy VII, he would create the sound effects for the famous Knights of the Round Summon, which took him no less than a week. Asari Naoko was a freelance musician who worked on projects for Square, and may have met the Saknoth team during that time. She's worked on music for anime, movies, television, and games since 1981, most famously working on sound direction for Studio Ghibli before going independent. In games, she was in charge of audio production for Xenogears and voice editing for Xenosaga. Mitome Kazumi was a sound composer who created music for games as well as anime and Japanese pop. She started at Square in 1993, working on Romancing Saga 2, Live Alive, and Mana 3. Junya Kuroda started at Square around 1996, working on sound effects for the Chocobo Dungeon series, Bushido Blade, and Xenosaga, as well as working on voice editing once voiceovers began to become a norm in the industry. A Mana 3 programmer would join Saknoth as well, Yoshieda Satoru. He started at Square in 1991 and was the main programmer on the first Mana game, before working on battle and monster programs for Romancing Saga and Mana 2. Yoshieda had history working on Square games with Ohashi Goro, sharing 2 patents with the man in the mid-90s. Ohashi was a game designer who worked on map design for Mana, battle design on Mana 3 and Final Fantasy VII. Another Square planner, Sakamoto Yuko, who worked on Frontier Saga, would also leave Square for Saknoth. These were likely the earliest establishing members of what would become Saknoth, who met at Square and likely left the company together, or came together over the period of a year before Koudelka would officially begin development. They weren't the only game veterans who would come to Saknoth. 2 team members came from Resident Evil 2. Nagano Hiroshi, who would play a major role in the game's development, working on debugging and background design, and Yamamoto Yoshihiro, an animator who would work on motion design. Mishima Koji began as a debugger in 1992. His role in Koudelka would seem to be large, perhaps overseeing the programmers as a whole, while also working on field and monster programming, and according to one document, designing all the monsters of the game. Most of the people working on Koudelka, however, were working on their first game. More than half of the game's developers were new to the industry, having come from other fields or were fresh out of school. Saknoth would be officially established in 1997, with sponsorship from SNK financing the venture, and in the fall of that year, Koudelka's development would begin. The creation of Koudelka would begin in much the same way Kikuda's interest in creation began, with reading. He would read over 100 books by the end of the project. But to begin, he started research in Japan, reading translated works from the West and nonfiction about Western culture, such as The History of Torture and History of Alchemy, a book exploring the history of strange texts of magic and occultism, Dracula's End, which follows the literary and cultural trends of hatred towards cultural outsiders, and City of Horror, a history text discussing London's darkest historical events. It was in these books that Kikuta would come across the works of Roger Bacon and The Sinking of the Princess Anne. Another book that was incredibly influential was Carnacki, the Ghost Finder, a work of fiction from the West written by William Hope Hodgson. It was a collection of occult-themed detective stories, which were sometimes ambiguous about the reality of the strange things happening in the tale. He liked the ambiguity and the experience of real people facing supernatural things, and having not only to survive but solve the mystery. H.P. Lovecraft's The Case of Charles Dexter Ward was also influential, as were many novels by Lord Dunsany, whose real name is Edward Plunkett, the real-world inspiration for the Koudelka character. There were also films that were part of his research, specifically The Name of the Rose from 1986. He also read the novel that inspired the film. Visually, the photographic works of Bob Carlos Clark, Jan Sadek, and Holly Warburton were also named as influences. Centering his storytelling on real-world events was crucial to Kikuta. He wanted the story to be real and fantastical. To do that, he felt using the framework of historical settings and events could help ground the game and add to the intriguing world-building. He knew early on he wanted it to be a horror story. Horror, he finds, is an easy way to introduce persuasiveness to the story. In other words, it is easier to make your audience care about people when they are in outlandish, dangerous situations. His goal was to make something scary to the touch, something that made you feel frightened enough you were afraid to touch it. And he felt that the small details, not big gimmicky things, would be the most important. The secret was not to bend history. It was to keep true to the historical record while weaving lies into the gaps of history. This blend of reality and fiction would create a very unique world and atmosphere in Koudelka. Though he researched eras of history stretching back into the medieval, he chose 1898 as his time period, and specifically the UK. It was a time of great change and a very potent historical era in the West. Technology and science were fast advancing, and yet magic and mysticism still clung to the world. Psychics and fortune tellers sold their expertise on the same streets as doctors and psychologists. In addition, the gas lamps used at the time could create an eerie kind of lighting and shadow that would add to the horror atmosphere. He would narrow down the time and place of their game to a specific location on a single night, because they simply didn't have the resources for a larger game. While Koudelka would be an RPG, it wouldn't be part of a large world. There would be no traveling to various towns and cities across a large map. They had to cut down to the bare bones in order to make something of high quality. All in all, it took Kikuta about 3 months to put together his concepts and world building for the scenario of Koudelka, which he would not only develop, but also write, and draw the storyboards, using techniques and skills he learned during his time as a manga artist. He would also design the map, though the building concepts themselves would be drawn by Matsuno Taizo, which were completed by February of 1998, as was the entire design of the map, with almost 100 rooms and 8 buildings. Each building had its own architectural style and age, to keep the experiences unique, as well as reflect the historical changes that had occurred over time. By this time, he'd also created the central conceit of their protagonist. Other characters in the story were easy. He was pulling on historical figures and events as inspiration. But their protagonist would be a new person, and at first he struggled to imagine who it would be. The eventual concept would be for a female Romani, exiled from home, the loneliest of people, because she was an outcast and a minority in a dangerous time, essentially an outcast of the outcast. She had magical powers relating to the themes of the supernatural, which would lead to her involvement in the story. And her name would be Koudelka, taken from the name of Josef Koudelka, the Czech-French photographer. Having heard the name, Kikuta couldn't immediately place the culture or country of origin, and he liked that feeling of mystery and ambiguity. At her heart, she was a character with strength, someone with a soft exterior and a harsh personality. Kikuta says in one interview that he likes women with a strong core, and if he was to name influences for the character, though he didn't have specific figures in mind, he might go for someone like Winona Ryder from Alien. From the beginning, Koudelka was a character with thin lines but a strong core. The character's design would be created via a contest. Various artists were asked to design her, and from those concepts, one design was chosen. The winner would be a piece from artist Iwahara Yuji, drawn on March 26, 1998. He would draw more than 100 works of art for the game, including dozens of Koudelka. While the game was in development, he would also write and draw the accompanying manga for the game, as well as many promotional images. It was not the final design, but it was the starting point, as Koudelka's character would go through vast changes, as the limitations of their technology created problems with the design. It would be at least 6 months before her design was finalized and her model completed. The problem was that CG was still incredibly new in video games, and major leaps in the technology were happening constantly. Much of Koudelka's development time was used figuring out these new technologies and how to best implement them. Other characters were not quite so difficult to develop. Edward would be drawn from history, and his design would portray a blend of criminality and heroism that hinted at his dual nature. O'Flattery would have the most variation in initial designs, ending in a younger but clearly aged religious figure. These three would be their central team, who would come across a series of terrible events and supernatural frights in the monastery that night in October 1898. Charlotte, the ghostly child they're confronted with, is also from the historical record. Her parents are real figures, best remembered for their illicit love affair which saw Charlotte's mother, Sophia Dorothea of Celle, spending more than half her life in prison, as she was at the time married to the future King of Great Britain. Charlotte is presented as the forbidden child born of their romance, raised in secrecy and left to die at the monastery, never knowing her mother was just as trapped as she was. The two caretakers are also connected to history. Ogden Hartman is said to have been the captain of the Princess Alice, which struck a coal steamer and sank, drowning most of the passengers and crew. The SS Princess Alice was a British paddle steamer that collided with the collier SS Bywell Castle on the Thames in September of 1878. Nearly 700 people died, making it the greatest loss of life of any water accident in the British Isles. And of course, Roger Bacon, the immortal magician whose research is central to the dark plot of Koudelka, is based on the historical Roger Bacon, an English philosopher and friar. The amount of detail and creativity in the blend of these many histories, traditions, and myths is truly astounding, and creates a beautiful and realistic world that feels as if it could almost be real in how closely tied it is to our own. While Kikuta had his concept, he still had to get his ideas across to his team, and it wasn't as easy as just telling them. The world he wanted to build was beautiful and haunting, and it was incredibly different to the Japan they lived in. Kikuta would go to CG Studios and attempt to describe his ideas and found it just wasn't working. He needed to show them. So in August of 1998, he and some artists from the team would leave Japan and go west to Pembrokeshire, a county in Wales in the UK. He says there were about 6 or 7 people with him on the trip, which is about the number of background designers for the game, which likely means it was this group who went. The trip would see them traveling across the countryside to cities and ruined monasteries, and across the border to London, England, over the course of half a month. The goal wasn't just to get an idea of what the country was like, but to take back resources that would assist the CG teams in developing the game. Each person had a camera and was taking pictures of everything. Not just buildings and scenery, but close-ups on rocks and grass, the side of walls, windows, anything and everything. The actual images of castle walls would be used for the textures. Real pictures of the environments would be behind the models of in-game pathways and scenery. Some of these pictures may be in the Koudelka guidebook from Japan. It certainly looks as if they were taken in Wales. They didn't just take pictures. They bought furniture, props, and materials from an antique shop. And while in London, they traveled to Foyle's bookstore, where Kikuta bought about 100 books, boxed them up, and mailed them home. The cashier was apparently laughing at the piles and piles of books the team was piling up before her, but Kikuta couldn't stand to leave any behind, because at the time they were resources that were not at all available in Japan. He also recorded sound while he was there for the environmental sound effects. The sound of rain falling on a Welsh church, footsteps walking on an abandoned gravel road, the voice of seagulls flocking under the cliff, waves that rush and shattered. In the final game, the sound of the characters' footsteps would actually change based on what material they were walking across. The stone walls of the old buildings would create a very different atmosphere for the sound, very different compared to what you might hear back home in Japan. They even used mocap while they were in Wales to capture the movements and behaviors of the locals in order to provide culturally appropriate body language for the characters. The most influential location they would see was St. David's Cathedral, a very famous old building that would be the inspiration behind Nemeton Monastery, Nemeton being a name used for Celtic holy places. St. David's was established in 589 and has a long history stretching back more than 1,000 years. The pictures would be turned into a CD and sent out to various CG studios once the team returned to Japan, and Wales would become the final location of their game. The original concept had been a town on the coast of Ireland, but after the trip, Kikuta chose Aberystwyth, Wales. which was in Ceredigion, the county next to Pembrokeshire. About half a dozen different studios would be involved in the CG and motion capture for Koudelka, including Japanese studios like Digital Media Lab, Shadow Entertainment, Japan Vistech, and a new studio, D3D. The head of D3D was Watanabe Shinji, who had just moved to Tokyo to establish a new company after the bankruptcy and closure of the company he was formerly employed with. He and a few of his colleagues founded the company and were trying to get their start in CG. They had no track record, but Kikuta was moved by their passion and took a chance on them. Watanabe would be behind designing Koudelka's in-game model, which would take about 6 months, given the challenges of adjusting her costume to work with the limited polygons, to fit Kikuta's very specific desires for her character, and to work with the learning curve that came from using a new technology. It's likely the other character models were also D3D's responsibility. Around September of 1998, Kikuta came to the realization that motion capture would help cover the shortage of people the company had, and greatly reduce their workload. Motion capture, or mocap, was incredibly new at the time, and almost non-existent in Japan. Companies were just starting to realize the potential, and were beginning to establish studios, but they weren't very developed yet. Kikuta knew his game was going to require more than Japan's industry could yet provide. For one, they had scenes with up to 4 characters, and no one had ever mocapped 4 people at a time. Japan studios couldn't do it. So he headed west once again, to Santa Monica, California, where the studios used for Hollywood movies were more established, and more willing to experiment with new and untried techniques. He found a studio through his connections working on Square's Sokagi. Otake Shigeru of Daybreak had worked with Kikuta then, and had connections in California that brought Kikuta together with Future Life, who had been heavily involved in pioneering motion capture techniques in the West, most famously with the film Godzilla. Their work would break new bounds in the East and West in the video game industry. Koudelka would be the first Japanese game to use lip sync, a technique used to match a character's lip movements to the recordings of a voice actor's performance. They would audition nearly 100 people for the roles, and most of those involved would have little to no acting records outside Koudelka. Michael Bradbury, the voice of Edward, would work on Warcraft 3. Gavin Carlton, who played Ogden, would work on plenty of mocap for games through 2017. Rob Brownstein, who played Alias, would also work on Murder Soul Suspect, Killzone 3, and The Evil Within. But most famously, the young 12-year-old actress who played Charlotte, Sarah Paxton, would grow up to be an incredibly successful TV and film star. It would be the first time 4 people were mocapped together, and their performance would not just be recording their motions, but also their voices at the same time. Kikuta asked the performers to memorize their lines and perform them all in one go, as if it was a stage performance. The whole process took about 4 days, and was recorded in January of 1999. On the Future Light side, the team would include Dan Mitchelson, the VP of the company, as well as John Schmidt, a mocap engineer, and Randy Stern, the motion capture developer and programmer who Kikuta called everybody's mom. Another company involved in the work was IPG, who seemed to have been working on the voice acting and script translation side of things. David Waldman was director, who flew in from New York to oversee the mocap sessions. Keith Garcia, the sound mixer, Paul Johnson, the production manager, and Craig Eggerts, the script supervisor and AD, were also present. On the Japanese side, the person in charge of the mocap was Takahara Shinji. His creative career began in music rather than motion. He joined a band in high school, but eventually entered a vocational school and studied interior design. He worked at a small design office for a while, but didn't find it fulfilling, and began looking for a way to shift from architecture to CG and computers. He didn't have a lot of programming experience, however. In high school, he and his friends designed games, but he was always the writer and musician. He wasn't involved in the technical side. Eventually, he bought a Mac, Photoshop, and 3D rendering software, and began teaching himself. Eventually, he'd find his way to Sony Computer Entertainment, working on various baseball titles, which is what originally piqued his interest in motion. He learned about the newly evolving technology of motion capture and got involved in its use, learning the ropes, becoming fascinated by this powerful new technology and the possibilities it presented. He was there when the first mocap studio in Japan opened in 1995, and has been considered a mocap evangelist in the country ever since. He would remain at SCE for 3 years before becoming involved with Seknoth. For Koudelka, he would work as a motion designer and would oversee all the motion capture. By the end, Koudelka would have over an hour and a half of dialogue and movie cinematics, and there were hundreds of thousands of individual shots. The team behind the CG would have to edit and perfect these scenes over the course of many months, which was backbreaking work. Kikuta was very particular about the scenes, even correcting a scene himself when he felt the final render didn't reflect his storyboard. The biggest problem, however, was correcting jitter, the natural shakes the human body has, which distorts mocap. The amount of data involved was huge. It got to the point designers were asked to save the data locally on hard drives, rather than bog down company servers. Another issue was color reduction. The PlayStation could only portray 256 colors, which limited the palettes the team could use. In particular, they were going to need a variety of dark colors to reflect the shadows and dim lighting of their haunted locale. They spent a lot of time experimenting with what colors and palettes looked best, and the darkest colors were the hardest to produce well. They would also be working on motion work for monsters and creatures, as they weren't mocapped and had to be done by hand. Of course, Kikuta Hiroki would be behind the soundtrack for Koudelka. He would compose the works, which took about 6 months, but he wasn't sure he'd be able to record them in Japan. Their game was set in Wales. They'd been heavily focused on creating the sensation you were present in the location. And sound is very different in an old stone building than it is a music studio. He wanted to record the soundtrack in a church, to have church echoes to the sound. But Japan didn't have the resources, and so it was back to England once again, where the soundtrack would be recorded at Air Studios, which was a converted church, an old stone building adapted to record music. It was exactly the environment he needed, but he didn't have time to be present himself. Instead, the music was recorded over a phone line in both England and Japan at the same time. It was a technique that had been used in other countries at the time, but Japan hadn't done it before, and it was very expensive. But the quality was incredible, and it allowed Kikuta to hear the music across the globe, give his feedback, and record it at the same time. Originally, he didn't want to include music in the field or battle portions. He felt the sound effects and atmosphere were more important to focus on, and the silence would allow the audience to cherish the atmosphere and presence of the place. His favorite melody of the pieces he composed was from Kiss Twice, the final boss theme for the game. Others working on the sound and music included Hirota Yoshitaka, who worked on sound effects. His goal was to tap into the world of gothic horror for the game, and to explore fear and genuine emotions of the gothic genre through sound. He was careful about creating the sound effects. For the effect of feet stepping across a pile of bones, he went to a meat market and bought up a collection of real animal bones. He also remembers working hard on the sound of monsters' limbs waving through the air. The project would run from the fall of 1997 to the end of 1999. Originally, Kikuta wanted the game to release in October, on the same day that the events of said game were supposed to happen, but they couldn't meet the deadline. It would instead release in Japan in December of 1999, in the US in the following June, and in the UK in September 2000. In its home country, it was released along with a special CD, and in its first week sold about 20,000 units. More than half of its sales would come from the United States, and in total it likely hit 100K in its first year. Responses were mixed. Some reviewers were truly moved by the haunting gothic atmosphere and incredible CG environments. Others were turned off by the battle style, which was a unique twist on turn-based combat that used a movement grid to combine some features of tactical RPGs with more traditional styles. The system allowed for characters to learn or specialize in a variety of move types and magic, with over 140 weapons in the game. But it certainly had a learning curve to it. It turned some reviewers off, and was the most controversial element of the game. Kikuta himself wasn't a fan of the system. He felt the grid immediately took the player out of the experience and reinforced the gamey aspect. and originally he wanted Koudelka to be more of a puzzle and adventure style game. But this was a group project, and clearly others felt the RPG blend was important. There are arguments to be made for both sides. The fact is, random battles do take away from the atmosphere, and the lack of monsters on the map was a complaint for many who preferred the Resident Evil or Silent Hill style. Yet the combat and the monsters added a level of enjoyment to the game, which also padded the short experience. Exploring the detailed mansion took longer because you had to struggle through it, and it felt like an accomplishment to survive the unique, entertaining spirits and creatures you came across. It blends many of my favorite elements of both genres, and even if they don't always blend together perfectly or have rough edges, the overall experience of the game is phenomenal. In the end, it's a matter of taste. Many were incredibly fond of the game, some were turned off. But on the whole, the world building, the storytelling, the CG and voice acting were all beyond reproach. It might not have been a game for everyone, but it was undoubtedly a unique and beautiful experience that deserves to be better enshrined in the history of video games as a whole. Kakuda himself says he was both happy and disappointed. In the aftermath, he would make the choice to leave Saknoth, going fully independent as a game composer. He's still working on games music today and keeping quite busy. He's appeared at many events in the East and West, attending American conventions, giving presentations and lectures in Japan, composing and releasing his own original music, and working on the soundtracks for many indie developers. He's also composed for eroge games, which he says he's not capable of recommending to others. His most recent game soundtrack was Indivisible in 2019. And he's still very fond of Koudelka. Much of the information for this project came from his own website, as well as his blog and various interviews in which he discusses the game. On Twitter, he calls Halloween Koudelka Day, and discusses the project from time to time. He'd still like to return to that universe. He had extensive plans on how to continue the story, including a sequel where Koudelka would travel to the World's Fair in Paris and fight ghosts in the catacombs, a third game that involved Koudelka's grandson in the Vietnam War, and a fourth set in Nara, Japan, which would involve Onmyoji. He's mentioned writing a novelization in the past, but has yet to do so. In the aftermath of Koudelka, Saknoth would evolve and continue to make games, most predominantly the much-beloved Shadowhearts series, the spiritual successor to Koudelka. They aren't quite the same, but borrow many of the same themes and ideas, and they have the same universe. The team behind Shadowhearts would include 18 former Koudelka developers, including Machida Matsuno, the art director of Koudelka, who would become director of Shadowhearts. After Shadowhearts, 4 team members, including Nagano Hiroshi, would join the team working on Clock Tower 3. Nagano would be the event movie director, with 2 former Koudelka team members, Ogawa Yoshihiro and Nagayoshi Makoto, working under him as movie designers. Yamamoto Yuji would be a gameplay designer. Eventually, Nagano would establish his own company, Peon Co. Ltd. His ultimate goal is to make fun games, especially games he can play with his kids, and he feels you have to be a gamer to make games. How can creators create play without playfulness? He asks. One game he would direct for the Wii seems to embody that idea, as you seem to play minigames for a cat CEO. The D3D team would remain together, and under the leadership of Watanabe, continue to work on mocap. Their next project would be Final Fantasy X, where Watanabe would be chief character and motion coordinator. This was the studio that had no experience when Kikuta Hiroki gave them a chance. Decades later, they've truly blossomed and are now known as D3D Limited. Takehara Shinji would eventually create his own motion capture studio, called Mozu, in 2004, and would continue to push the boundaries of mocap in Japan. He was a major force behind its development in the country, and his studio would be the first in Japan to mocap a horse. Yamamoto Yoshihiro would work on many games after Koudelka and the first Shadowhearts, including stage design for Forbidden Siren 2 in 2006. Today, he's seemingly at Square Enix, where he's worked as manager on 2 of my favorite lesser-known RPGs, The Legend of Legacy and the Alliance Alive HD Remaster. Hidenori Suzuki would establish his own studio in 2002, developing sound drivers and tools for music development for consoles, and later working on phone applications. Junya Kuroda would join him at the company called Procyon Studios. His most recent work is Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Hiroda Yoshitaka released his first original soundtracks after leaving Square, and would arrange all the music for the Shadowhearts series. Currently, he owns his own studio, Twin Tail Studio, and his most recent work was Saga Scarlet Grace in 2018. And, of course, Pennyblood, the spiritual return of Shadowhearts, which includes on its team two original Koudelka team members, Machida Matsuno and Hiroda Yoshitaka. It's exciting to see their still love and passion for the Shadowhearts series, and I hope Koudelka can receive some of the love alongside it. While it may be lesser known and is certainly harder to obtain, without it we never would have received the later games, which many consider some of the best RPGs around. Koudelka was truly historic, achieving firsts in motion capture history and lip sync, pushing the boundaries of possibilities of CG technology, and starting the careers of many young developers. It is a beautiful and haunting experience about love and survival, with some of the best PS1 era world building, storytelling, character writing, and dialogue, as well as top-tier cinematics and environments. It's an incredible part of gaming history, and one I hope more people will appreciate in the years to come.